the case as we saw with Alpha. We can expect some increased transmissibility. We can expect some immune escape. All of those we can expect. But there's also a large number of mutations, as Penny pointed out, that we simply don't know. We have no idea what they do, and we're going to learn about them now as we see how this virus develops. So, what can we tell about the three questions? Is it more transmissible? The answer to that is, at this point, certainly when we look at the data from Gauteng province, which is the most advanced part of the South African epidemic, here I'm showing you the first wave, the second wave, and then the really significant in the orange color, the third wave due to Delta. And now I'm showing you in the red, the wave due to the Omicron variant. And what we see here is a line that's really steep. It's increasing at a more rapid rate than at the same time that we saw the increases in the first three waves. So clearly, at this point, if this is anything to go by, we can expect that it has increased transmissibility. The extent to which it is more transmissible than Delta remains to be measured, but at this point, it looks like it's more transmissible than Delta. One has to be somewhat careful in over-interpreting this very steep curve, because South Africa, at this equivalent time in the previous three waves, instituted several measures to curtail movement and restrictions. Whereas for the fourth wave, South Africa chose not to implement any restrictions, not even on gathering. So this reflects a completely uncontrolled environment. Not completely, we do have some restrictions like masks, but it's much fewer restrictions than we've seen before. But even with that situation, we are still seeing a level of increase that is way beyond what we would expect, and certainly indicates a much more transmissible virus. What about severity? And here I'd like to borrow on data presented by Dr. Wasila Jassid. And this comes from a national database of admissions. And I think this table gives us a pretty good clue. So here we are. This is the hospital admissions in Tshwane Metro. Now, this is Pretoria. This is where the first cases were described. So it has the most advanced Omicron epidemic. So we can look at it with a lot more data, longer period than we can for the rest of the country. So if you just look at this area, what you see is in the past three waves, what we had in these 20,000 odd admissions, about 2 out of every 3 admissions were severe cases. Severe being defined as patients admitted needing oxygen, needing assisted ventilation, needing ICU care, or that they died. So that's, by definition, those are the cases of severe disease. And 2 out of every 3 admissions across our 3 past waves were severe cases. However, in the first 3 weeks of November, when we look at the current admissions, most of these are Omicron, what we are seeing is, in fact, that only 1 out of 4 cases are now severe. So there are far fewer severe cases being admitted at this time in the Tshwane Pretoria area than we had in our 3 previous waves. And now, again, one has to be cautious in the interpretation, because during the early stages of the wave, we tend to be willing to admit less severe cases because we have beds. But as the wave progresses, there's pressure on beds, and so we only admit more severe cases. Now, despite that, if you look at the equivalent periods in our previous waves, we still see that there is a lower level of severity amongst those that have been admitted. And it's quite a marked difference. And it's not unique to any one particular age. It's across all the age group, including those who are above 60. You can see the impact that it has had, that in this particular wave, the proportion of patients who are severe is less. And even in our age groups where there is much less vaccination, so you wouldn't see this largely as a vaccine effect. Again, we see lower levels of severe infection in the fourth wave than we did in our previous waves. Let's look at diagnostics. Well, most of our diagnostics seem to be doing quite well across all the platforms we have in South Africa right now. We are detecting no particular issues. Of course, with the Thermo Fisher kit, you can identify Omicron without doing gene sequencing because of the S gene target failure. Most of the S gene target failures we have now in South Africa, most of them are Omicron. In terms of current treatments, our current treatment protocols still are in effect, seem to be doing all well. Dexamethasone, tocilizumab, all are doing well. Now, we don't use monoclonal antibodies to any significant extent in South Africa, but some new data we've just seen suggests that at least 2 of the monoclonals are not effective. And of course, we're waiting to hear about some of the oral antivirals, particularly integrase inhibitors like Paxlovid. They are not spike dependent, so you wouldn't expect that they would be impacted in any way. And in fact, I saw a press release this morning from Pfizer saying that they've looked at it and there's no impact of Omicron on Paxlovid. But what about our public health interventions? The answer to that is yes, they all remain effective, mask, social distancing, and so on. So let's go to probably the issue that we most are grappling with, and that is, are we seeing immune escape? Well, this data comes from Juliet Pullian from a center called SACIMA in Stellenbosch in South Africa, and what she has here is a measure of reinfection. So when a person tests positive, the database can search backwards to look for whether there's another test that was positive. And it really was originally designed to eliminate duplicates, but it can identify somebody who was positive in the previous waves. And so using that, she was able to identify that at this stage, the proportion of reinfections we are seeing during the fourth wave due to Omicron is much higher than we would anticipate. Indeed, she showed that it's 2.4 times higher as a ratio to primary infection in the fourth wave compared to the past wave. So it looks like the past infections with beta and delta are providing little, if any, protection. And that's confirmed by a preprint, which has shown that individuals who were previously infected with alpha, beta, and delta, that if you looked at their ability, their antibodies and immune responses to neutralize either the alpha variant, the beta variant, the delta variant, or Omicron, you can see what a marked difference it is. Generally, we see some reduced neutralization to beta, some further reduction in neutralization to delta, but marked against the Omicron variant. And this goes across the board. So it confirms what we're seeing in terms of the number of reinfections, and we can expect many reinfections to occur, because if you were infected in the past with either alpha, beta, or gamma, you'll have very little immune response in terms of antibody neutralization to the virus. But what about immune escape to vaccine-induced antibodies, not natural immunity? And here, yes, the Pfizer antibodies have diminished neutralization. You already saw this from Penny's data. She showed you the study that was undertaken by Alex Segal and Sandina Kele from Ari upstairs, one floor above me. And they showed what a drastic reduction, averaging around 40-fold lower neutralization of Omicron versus D614G. That was confirmed by other studies, by Daniel Sherwood, that also showed similar levels of reduction. And what we've seen that if you look at individuals who've had 2 Moderna vaccines or 2 AstraZeneca, or an AstraZeneca plus Pfizer or 2 Pfizer, and you look at their ability, their antibody responses, ability to neutralize the different viruses. So that's the alpha variant, the beta variant, the delta variant, and Omicron. It is quite striking how there is such a drastic reduction in neutralization to Omicron, regardless of the vaccine you're looking at. Across the board, we see reductions in neutralization. How does that translate? Well, this is a study just released. I think it's not even 48 hours old, from England. And here they used the test negative case control method, where they looked at about 581 symptomatic Omicron cases that they've already had in the UK. And they were able to estimate the efficacy, the vaccine efficacy. And it's quite striking when you look at, so the first graph is 2 doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine. And if you look at the 2 doses of AstraZeneca vaccine, this is the time interval since the last dose. So this is now at 24 weeks after the dose, so that's about 6 months. You can see how for the Delta variant, the efficacy of 2 doses of AstraZeneca goes from close to 80, comes all the way down to around 40% reduction, 40% in vaccine efficacy. For Omicron, it's even out of the graph. It's virtually 0. So they're seeing no reduction, no neutralization of Omicron, no vaccine efficacy. They're not seeing any prevention benefit of 2 doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine against Omicron. However, when the 2 doses of Pfizer followed up, 2 doses of AstraZeneca followed up by a booster with a Pfizer dose, they see neutralization, and they're seeing, in this case, vaccine efficacy coming up close to around 75%. Now, if you look at 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine, the squares are Delta. You can see how across time, with time, we see waning immunity and we see lower vaccine efficacy, coming from around 90-odd% down to around 60% at about 6 months. But what about Omicron? Well, Omicron, they're seeing a much more drastic reduction. And you see it here, I've provided the actual data. So for 2 doses of AZ, almost no vaccine efficacy, even if you got it recently. But once it's boosted with Pfizer, we see efficacy at around 71%. If you've taken 2 doses of Pfizer, as is widely used in South Africa and many other countries, shortly after the Pfizer vaccine, you see very high efficacy, 88%. But within a matter of 3 months, it's gone down to 49%. When you start getting to 4, 5, 6 months, it's now down to 35%. But when you boost the Pfizer, it goes back up to 76%. So this is giving us some indication that with waning immunity with Pfizer, we are going to see a lot of breakthrough infections. And in those with 2 doses of AZ that's not boosted, we're going to see a lot of breakthrough infections. Now, Omicron has an increased risk of immune escape. This is likely to affect clinical efficacy. We've already seen this. We've dealt with this in the past. We saw how AstraZeneca, which was 70% effective against D614G, was only 10% effective against Beta, but was 60% effective against Delta. We're seeing how Pfizer was 91 to 95% effective against D614G, also against Beta, but now seems to be much lower against Omicron. So we're used to dealing with this. We've seen it in the past. We need to be better adapted. Now, what we do know, and I'll end off on this note, that vaccines remain effective over time with all the other variants that we have seen. And I've shared with you here data from Kaiser Permanente in California, where up to 6 months against Alpha and Delta, we see continued very high efficacy against hospitalization, and the same in New York State. We saw this morning from Discovery Health, they released some data showing that with the 2-dose Pfizer, that the Omicron infection is associated with vaccine efficacy for severe disease, well, really for hospitalization, is now down to 70%. But the methodology used in the study is a bit different. And so I wouldn't put too much store on this right now. We'll wait to see what the longer term data show. But even in Israel, the data I'm showing you here, whether it's younger people or the elderly, you see very high levels of vaccine efficacy for severe disease and hospitalization, regardless of variant and regardless of time since vaccine, the last dose of the vaccine. So we would expect similar levels, if not that high, but in the high range, and certainly not as low as 70% as currently shown. We also have seen how vaccines against the Delta variant, even though they don't prevent symptomatic infection, that we see the viral loads go down much faster in vaccinated people. So there's a community benefit. There's a prevention benefit to getting vaccinated against Delta. Now, Omicron, we've seen the latest data on the CT values, has a higher viral load. But we don't yet know if vaccines reduce that viral load. That remains to be seen. But these are two good reasons why vaccines should be used. And so we need to be able to convert the scientific success of Southern Africa now into a success, not that scientific, but now in our response. So there's no need to panic. We've dealt with variants before, including variants with immune escape. Closing borders has almost no benefit, as we've seen, even though some countries have chosen to go that route. And the four things we really need to do, that is, we need to be better prepared from a hospital, because with higher transmissibility, we'll see more cases, more pressure on hospitals, even if Omicron is not severe, and certainly the early data on severity show no red flags. Our public health prevention measures work. Let's use them. And while we're likely to see more reinfections and breakthrough infections, the vaccinated are less likely to have severe COVID and maybe less likely to transmit, although that remains to be seen. So vaccinate, in other words, our path forward, combination prevention. Vaccines are not a silver bullet, but can be used as a critically important measure in our prevention strategy, especially when we use them with our other prevention measures like masks and so on. So we have a clear way in which we can make a difference in the fourth wave, combination prevention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Karim, for your very rich presentation on what we know and what we don't know. Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, we have heard about where we started, what's going on, and let's dive into predicting what can happen in the future. For that, I would like to call upon Professor Abubakar. Professor Abubakar is the Dean of Faculty of Population Health Sciences and Professor of Infectious Disease Epidemiology at University College London. And he will tell us about predicting the future of COVID-19 in Africa. Professor Abubakar, welcome, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So I'll start by saying I obviously don't have a crystal ball, so no magic here. But we've heard a lot about the behavior of COVID, and using that sort of framework, my thesis is that there are a few contextual factors, and we know the determinants of transmission, and we know the determinants of severity of disease. And by speculating on the interplay between these factors, we can begin to guesstimate what Africa needs to do and what might happen in the future. So I'll cover each of these areas sequentially. So in terms of the context and the background, one thing we know for certain is that over the last 2 decades, 3 different coronaviruses have emerged with pandemic potential, with SARS-CoV-2 causing COVID-19 being the major one that we are dealing with. So what is certain is there will be other coronaviruses that will emerge, and indeed other respiratory viruses in our lifetime. And we need to be prepared for that. That is the future. We also have seen the remarkable progress that's been made in terms of our ability to do surveillance and measure the levels of COVID. But we can't deny the fact that the lower numbers of COVID-19 cases across the continent is partly a reflection of the level of under-ascertainment in our surveillance data. Now, that's not to say the data are not useful. Data on surveillance, even if not complete, can provide a good proxy in changes in incidence. And I believe that a lot of the variation we see in the levels in the different parts of the continent, as shown on the graph here, have a lot to do with levels of testing, but also maybe to some degree in the different waves, specific outbreaks in those parts of the world. And the very low levels, especially in Western Africa, I would argue reflect largely on the testing. And I will demonstrate that with some of the data on serosurveillance, which has been referred to, despite all of the limitations of serosurveillance data, which suggests that they are not really comparable because people are using different techniques, as well as the sample size has been small. It is without a doubt the case that the levels of seropositivity suggest that incidence of COVID-19 in most African settings is of the order of 20 to 100-fold more than is reported. And if you look at the secular data for the few places where there's good such data, for example, in South Africa, the trajectory is clearly that many more people have been infected than we can see with the number of reported cases with PCR. And the table here summarizes what's in the published literature about surveillance. And I'm acutely aware that there are other serosurveillance data being held by partners that are not actually being shared with national public health authorities. And for me, this is a critical issue, and the crux of the matter is all partners really ought to share those data with national public health authorities and with the Africa CDC. Another element or way to look at under-ascertainment is illustrated by this study that we did during the second wave in Nigeria with colleagues of the Nigeria CDC, led by Dr. Eladin. And what we did there is a cohort study of just under 5,000 people, looking at testing everybody on arrival in a national youth camp, so young adults. And we were able to show that at the beginning of that wave, of the order of 1 in 10 people were PCR positive, clearly demonstrating that the reported numbers are a huge underestimate. But not only did we do that, we tried to measure incidence by retesting those that are negative after 3 weeks in the camp, and 5% of them were positive. That for me confirms that almost certainly any reported data you see underestimates the disease. But these are young adults, so they largely did not have symptoms and did not present with severe disease. And I'll come back to that in the second half of my talk. So for me, we've heard a lot about the evolution of viruses and the variants and their importance. I'd say what the future holds is an interplay between 4 key factors in terms of transmission. What would happen would be driven in part by seasonality and what time of the year we are, largely because that affects human behavior and how we mix, by immunity. And this refers to both how good we happen to be in getting vaccines to people and vaccinating our people, but also the consequence of natural immunity from prior infection. Of course, the evolution of viruses and the emergence of variants is important, but finally, mitigation would matter. And I'll take each of these factors in turn. So if we start with seasonality, I think we now have ample data from around the world, as demonstrated on this slide with the study done on over 400 cities, ecological comparison to see how what factors correlate with at the beginning of the pandemic increase in cases. And it's clear that while there is a nonlinear association between temperature and the increases in COVID in the different cities, there's little evidence of that the strict meteorological conditions are actually the influencing factors that led to the increase. And the main drivers were in fact population behavior. So people's response to the changes in temperature rather than the change in temperature itself. And importantly, intervention by governments. So seasonality is a key driver, largely indirectly through how we behave for COVID. The second factor that I would like to refer to is immunity. And we've had a lot about immunity. Key to immunity is vaccination. And the more we are able to get to vaccinate people, the more likely that we will mitigate against the impact of COVID-19. Sadly, for most people in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, levels of vaccination remain incredibly low, as shown by this map from Africa CDC, whereas people in South Africa and in North Africa, Morocco, Egypt, etc., have high levels of vaccination. For the poorest parts of Africa, whether it's Chad or Burundi, levels of vaccination remain dismally low. And we have to do something about that if we are to change the trajectory. We know for a fact that if you look at places like Morocco with high vaccination rates and you juxtapose that against levels of stringency and the incidence of COVID, as shown in this three-dimensional figure, without a doubt, vaccination works. And in the absence of new variants emerging, levels of COVID decrease. So we must get vaccines to our people. But the story isn't that simple. So if we take the case of Zambia, for example, despite low vaccination rates and in fact, levels of stringency that are really, really low at the moment, it seems that although recent data suggests it's a slight uptick in the past few weeks, the levels remain moderately low. Some of that is under testing, but it's unlikely that we have a big epidemic that we're missing. And it's unclear what that is, why that is the case. Most likely it is to do with natural exposure to previous infection in the absence of a strain or variant that generates a response that can evade that immune response. So natural immunity and exposure to previous infection is an important element. And places like South Africa, with some of the best serosurveillance data, probably provide us with an insight of what could happen. We know that because of the good data there, this information from the South African Modeling Consortium shows that in almost all regions, sequentially over time, levels of seroprevalence as detected by serosurveys has been increasing over time in every region of South Africa. Despite that, due to the emergence of variants, due to seasonality, and due to mixing patterns, we've seen multiple waves, suggesting that even high levels of seroprevalence is not going to protect us. And therefore, going into the future, when new variants emerge or when previously unvaccinated populations are challenged by variants such as Omicron, we would have continued waves of COVID. Fortunately, as we've had, the vaccines, especially when boosted, would seem to have an effect on even Omicron in terms of severe disease. And I say, for me, that has huge implications for the future, which is we're not looking at just the 1.8 billion doses of vaccine that Dr. Nkengasong mentioned, but indeed we are looking for a lot more if we are to move from vaccinating the continent to being able to move to the front of the queue for boosters. So self-sustainability and local manufacturing is the only way around that. What about mitigation? Again, the excellent response by many African governments at the beginning of the pandemic proves that if you are able to restrict movement and put those restrictions in place, then you would control the spread of COVID. Similarly, that ecological study I described showed that you can't stop COVID from spreading by putting strict measures in place. Sadly, that is not economically sustainable. And for many African countries, it's not really justifiable to put very strict measures. Therefore, what we are left with is all the items that Professor Abdul Karim mentioned around public health measures on use of masks, not going in when you're to work, when you are symptomatic, etc. And those are the measures that are left in terms of mitigation. The fourth factor, which has been extensively covered, is the evolution of the virus and the emergence of variants. And I'm not going to repeat the points that have been made, but this phylogenetic tree that I've included here, I want to make a few points about the emergence of variants. The first is to say that it seems to be the case that the key mutations that are needed for this virus to either evade immunity or to be more transmissible seem to occur independently multiple times in multiple variants of concern. It's not really sequential evolution where the mutations build up, but Delta evolved differently from Omicron in terms of how it accrued those mutations. And that is, for me, an implication of that would be that in the future, we are going to have more variants. It's not if, there will be additional variants. It's also interesting that some of the scale of evolution, whether it is in an animal intermediary host or indeed in immunocompromised individuals, if in the scale of the last 12 to 18 months that we've had COVID, we can have Omicron ending up with this degree of difference, and this graph actually just only shows the mutations, not the indels, then the probability that another strain could emerge that is different is indeed very worrying and could happen, and the future may be that of a vaccine that may evade immune response and also the vaccines. Fortunately, not yet. This graph, the third graph, has already been covered in detail, and it's the totality of the strains on GZ showing Omicron emerging and the predominance still of Delta globally, but that is rapidly changing. So coming back to my point about transmission, I think ultimately what would happen in the future is a function of these four factors that I've outlined. And in a scenario of country 1 and 3, where the balance is that the controlling factors predominate, we're likely to see some control of the epidemic. By contrast, if a new variant emerges or your mitigation measures or vaccination is too low, then you'd end up in the country 2 scenario and have high levels of infection. I'd now like to move on to the second part, and I have only a few slides on this, to say that Africa has been spared the brunt of COVID-19, largely because of the factors that relate to whether you have severe disease or not. And I think there are 3 key factors: age, comorbidity, and medical interventions. And I'll start with age. We all know that we have a very young population on the continent, with sub-Saharan Africa having a median age of 18, and only 3% of people being above the age of 65. If we had the population demographics of Italy, the outcome of COVID over the last 2 years in Africa would have been devastating. And I would argue that what we need to pray for and hope for is that either a new virus with outsized impact in the young does not emerge, or that COVID does not mutate to affect young people. Otherwise, Africa would have a huge problem. Secondly, we've heard that the vaccines have been good in preventing severe disease. This, for me, says that we need to really move rapidly to get to the point where the majority of the continent is vaccinated, because if that remains the case, then even if COVID continues to spread, we will be able to mitigate against the impact of severe disease. Thirdly, I would say comorbidity. And by comorbidity, I do not mean early phase of, say, diabetes or mild overweight, or indeed people with immunocompromised conditions, including HIV. But more severe forms, such as individuals who are on multiple preparations of insulin, such as individuals that are very obese, or indeed people who are in nursing homes with end-of-life care. These are the people that COVID devastated in the last 18 months. And almost coincidentally, because a large chunk of the African population in rural areas do not have the ability to access medical care and remain alive with serious comorbidity, COVID has spared a large chunk of the population. But the future, and as our economies develop, may not hold, and people may survive with these comorbidities and suffer the consequence. We clearly need access to vaccines, steroids, antivirals, monoclonals, and hospital care. Some have argued that human genetic susceptibility has a place. I am very skeptical. Although they've elegantly described in Nature and New England Journal publications a Neanderthal haplotype that seem to confer susceptibility to severe disease, the very fact that there's been an outsized impact of mortality among Black people in the US and the UK suggests to me that it's not just simply ancestry and Neanderthal genes that is driving the severity of COVID. So again, it is an interplay of these three factors: comorbidity, availability of interventions, age, and vaccines that seem to drive severity of disease. I'd like to conclude with a slide on where I think we must go, given the uncertainties of the future. The immediate futures, I'd say, are not different from what Dr. Ikenga-san has said at the beginning of the talk. We need vaccination, we need to ramp this up, and we need to make sure that there is local, reliable supply and sustainable supply within the continent, and not just purchasing from others. And we need public health measures. We need to build on the excellent work of the Africa CDC around manufacturing and extend that to partnerships in diagnostics, in treatments, and in medical supplies more broadly. And we need leadership, serious leadership by our heads of states in terms of wider pandemic preparedness beyond COVID. But for me, the crux of the matter is really the medium term, where we need greater investment in health systems and in our national economies. For it's only through that that people will stop banning us when we detect new variants, while not giving us access to the relevant technologies. We need to invest in research and innovation so that we are not waiting for others to hand over the technology to us. We need discovery science so that on the continent, a bit like the Chinese did, we are able to design our own vaccines at the beginning of the next pandemic. But ultimately, we need to think of industrial innovation beyond just giving money to the private sector to set up factories, but thinking through the complex process of incentivizing the private sector so that anything we do is sustainable, because the attention that COVID has brought now may lead to the building of multiple factories. When I was growing up in Nigeria, vaccines were being made locally. Those disappeared, and the same thing could happen again. And the necessary thinking required would call for something like the mission-oriented approach from my colleague, Mariana Mazzucato, that thinks of all the puzzles on all the pieces so that when we build factories, they're actually sustainable and appropriately incentivized. Above all, I think we need leadership, ambition, long-term planning, and maybe, like the Japanese did in the Meiji Restoration, we need to send our people to China, to India, and to Europe to learn how to do these things and come back home and deliver. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abubakar, and to all of the presenters today. You've provided really an excellent context on the epidemiology, virology, prevention, treatment, and future of SARS-CoV-2 in Africa. We have just a little bit of time remaining for a panel discussion now, and we've received a number of questions from attendees in the audience today. one that I'd like to pose to any in the group who are interested to answer. It has to do with the fact that we've heard a lot about the importance of vaccines, developing treatments, and even non-pharmacologic interventions to prevent SARS-CoV-2 transmission in Africa. We also heard a bit about animals as a reservoir for disease and viral replication that contributes to the development of new variants. So can someone comment on the potential role of One Health and veterinary science as additional efforts or measures to prevent or combat this and future disease outbreaks?
Perhaps I'll just make an initial comment for my colleagues. I think we saw certainly from the data in Denmark, where farm workers on the mink farms were infecting minks, and minks were then infecting farm workers, and the number of mutations that were occurring, and especially concerning mutations. So we have some idea that certainly biologically it's plausible that there's a link between the transmission from humans to animals and animals into humans that may lead to mutations. Whether they've been responsible for any of the variants is an open question because we don't know where the variants came from. And I think that what it's highlighting is that we're never going to eliminate this virus because it infects all kinds of different animals, including tigers in the Bronx Zoo have been infected with SARS-CoV-2. So it's a ubiquitous infection. I think what's at issue is that if we're going to maintain our surveillance as we have in humans, we're going to have to extend that to monitor what are the variants of SARS-CoV-2 that are in both domestic animals like cats and dogs, which get infected, and in wild animals over time so that we have a fuller picture of SARS-CoV-2. Because in many ways, this is a trial run because there are thousands of beta coronaviruses in horseshoe bats. We've just seen 3 of them enter into humans, SARS-CoV-1, MERS, and SARS-CoV-2. We don't know what's coming down the line. And so the better systems we set in place now, the better prepared we'll be for the next pandemic. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Perhaps I can add on to that. I agree with what's been said. I think that the most immediate problem is, in fact, the number of infections that are occurring across the world and the immune pressure that the virus is coming under. And I think we're providing this virus with every opportunity that it needs. I don't dispute the fact that animal infections may be contributing to this at all. But my suspicion is that this is a minor player. And that if we could get the number of infections down by increasing the vaccine coverage across the world, then that would be a more effective immediate response.
I was just going to contribute by saying that for over the years, we've talked about One Health. And there's no other moment other than now to really implement that. I mean, the challenge with One Health has been always in the implementation. And there's really the opportunity now to translate that into to practicalities. We at the Africa CDC have actually developed a framework across the African Union using its entire, harnessing its entire assets that exist from the AU NEPA at AU IBAT, which is the animal side of Africa CDC in Nairobi, and others to really have that joined in. But the key is really the partnerships that are required to begin to implement the One Health. Clearly, 60 to 70% of our infectious disease threats come from animals. I think we have been saying that for years, but actualizing that and operationalizing One Health has always been a challenge, and we really need to have a dialogue on that.
So just to add and agreeing with John, that I think actually the critical issue is the scale of it. So to do One Health properly on funding review panels, I see almost every country, individual or group, wanting to do it separately. So just the sheer scale of where to look, what to look for, what technological approaches to use to search is so vast that unless we are coordinated, I would argue actually as a planet, we are unlikely to predict and appropriately prepare for the next pathogen. You could focus on MERS in the Middle East, and then coronavirus arises from elsewhere. It needs to be a lot more coordinated.
Thank you for those insights. We really have a few minutes left. what message do you send to African leaders in order for our countries to be ahead of the next wave and control COVID-19? Just one thing for each one of you before we close.
Maybe I go first, so that if I slip, Slim and Professor Abubakar can correct me, can round the edges here. Rather than say one thing, I'll say two things. Actually, three things very quickly. There's vaccinate at scale and at speed. So vaccines are beginning to come in, and we should really build our vaccination, increase our vaccination efforts. And on Monday, the 20th of December, we at Africa CDC, together with the WHO Afro and the African Union Commission, are convening a meeting of all ministers of health to discuss just that. How do we scale up vaccination? Not acquisition of vaccines, but vaccination, together with partnerships. Second thing is the testing. We have to test and test and test. I think Ibrahim said this very well. I mean, the testing, and you saw the data presented from very fresh data that has not been published yet from the 5 countries showing really vast underestimate. We really need to increase our testing. Third and lastly is public health measures. We have to, those public health measures work against all variants. And there's no variant that has been shown to go through hands that have been properly washed, to go through social distancing, to go through a mask. So I think those 3 things must be done and done simultaneously.
Very quickly. Thank you, John. Very quickly, one more thing. We need to wrap up and go.
Developing our own vaccines. Developing our own vaccines. We have all the tools to fight the variants, and we need to do all of those things, but we need to look to the future as well as a continent. We need to have the capacity to make our own vaccines.
And I'll just quickly add that I think in preparation for the next wave or next pandemic, preparedness. And that preparedness is about ensuring, we have the surveillance in place, we have the tools like diagnostics, vaccines, and treatments, and then we have the people skilled and the resources in terms of hospital beds and people to promote prevention and do all of those things. So prepare, prepare, prepare.
So while agreeing with all of that, one final point, I think the thinking space to plan all of this properly in a sustainable manner and not just do quick fixes. It's my own addition.
Wonderful. This has been a fantastic first session of the Public Health International Conference in Africa. Thank you all for your brilliant presentations. Thank you to those who have followed us. Stay tuned. History is being made. Continue to follow the Conference on Public Health in Africa. Thank you very much to all of you.